There's an idea that modern science has been running on for about 100 years. Your brain makes your consciousness. Electrical signals fire through neural tissue and out comes thought, memory, the entire feeling of being you. Change the brain, the mind changes. Shut the brain down, lights out. That model works. It explains an enormous amount. But if that model is the whole story, then what happened to Robert Monroe in 1958 should be impossible. Bob Monroe was a broadcast engineer in Virginia, running a radio production company. He worked with audio signals every day. Frequency, modulation, signal clarity. Very technical, very methodical. One night he was falling asleep. He felt a vibration. Not outside his body, inside it. A distinct oscillation running through him, getting stronger until he couldn't move. But he was fully conscious, wide awake, paralyzed, vibrating. And then the part that didn't fit. He rolled out of his body, stood beside his bed, looked down at himself lying under the covers. The room was stable, spatially accurate. When it ended, he remembered every detail. His first reaction wasn't spiritual. His first thought was, something is wrong with my brain. He assumed seizures, a tumor. He went to the doctors, got tested. The whole process. They found nothing. No lesion, no seizure disorder, no abnormality of any kind. And then these episodes kept happening. And here's where it gets interesting. They weren't random. They followed a pattern. Every time. Relaxation first, then vibration, then the shift. Same sequence, over and over, consistent enough that it stopped feeling like a malfunction and started feeling like a process. Now, if you're a neuroscientist watching this, you already have answers. Sleep paralysis can hold your mind awake while your body stays locked down. There's a region called the temporoparietal junction that builds your brain's model of where you are located in space. When it glitches, you can feel like you're floating above your own body. Doctors have recreated this with electrodes, so the neurology checks out. So what makes Monroe hard to explain away? He didn't have one episode under stress and then move on with his life. He had hundreds. They were structured, and eventually, he learned to control them. Fear collapsed to the state. Calm held it open. And once he figured that out, it stopped being something happening to him and started to become something he could enter deliberately. The standard science position is straightforward. He found a reliable way into a dissociative state. The brain builds a model of self-location, and under certain conditions that model shifts. Impressive neuroplasticity. Case closed. Except, the case isn't quite closed, because neuroscience can describe what the brain does during conscious experience. It can map every correlate, but it has never explained why electrical activity produces experience in the first place. Why does it feel like something to be you? That's called the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains wide open. In 2015, cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman argued that evolution doesn't optimize your perception for accuracy.
It's not there to show you the reality of the computer. In fact, it's there to hide that reality. We're inclined to think that perception is like a window on reality as it is. The theory of evolution is telling us that this is an incorrect interpretation.
Think about that for a second. Your entire experience of the physical world might be an interface. Like a desktop on a computer, you see icons, you don't see the code underneath. More recently, Federico Fagin, the man who designed the first commercial microprocessor, the chip that made modern computing possible, argued that consciousness might not come from computation at all. He frames it in a way that genuinely changes the way that you think about your own body.
Imagine that you control a drone. The drone looks at that reality where it is, sends me information, and I get the conscious experience of what the drone is seeing. That conscious experience is not in my body, is in my consciousness.
These ideas are debated. They won't prove Monroe was right, but they crack the door open, because if the experts themselves aren't sure that awareness has to originate inside your skull, then Monroe's experience moves from impossible to controversial, and controversial is where our investigation begins. Monroe didn't go public right away. For years, the experiences stayed completely private, but he was mapping everything. The vibration was always the entry point. He described it as mechanical, a progressive oscillation that started subtle and built until his entire body was resonating. Then the paralysis, but with full mental clarity. Sometimes he genuinely believed he was having a cardiac event. Sometimes he thought his brain was shutting down. But every time he panicked this way, the state collapsed instantly, snapped right back into his body. But when he stayed calm, the state held, and the separation happened smoothly. So he started experimenting. Posture, breathing, mental focus during the vibrational phase. Instead of fighting the onset, he let it build. The process got smoother, less chaotic, more navigable. That's the shift that matters. He went from treating these frightening episodes to treating them as controlled experiments. And once he's running experiments, he started running tests. In his first book, Journeys Out of the Body, Monroe describes being told about a seance happening in a New York apartment. During an out-of-body episode, he reportedly found a location and observed the room. 4 women seated around a table. He described the layout in detail. Afterward, he checked with the organizer. According to Monroe, the number of people and the room setup matched what he saw. He also reported that at one point during the seance, someone sat in the chair that had been jokingly reserved for Monroe. The comment afterward, "Don't sit on Bob." Was this laboratory-grade proof? No, it was a post-hoc comparison. But from Monroe's perspective, the alignment went well above coincidence. Then he tried something more direct. During an out-of-body episode involving a woman he identified as RW, Monroe decided to create a physical marker, a deliberate test. He reported pinching her side at a specific location, just above the hips, well below the ribcage. The logic was simple. If this is entirely internal, no trace should appear. Days later, he asked RW if anything unusual had happened. According to his account, she reacted with a visible surprise. She showed him bruise marks in the exact location he described. She said she felt a sudden painful pinch while sitting and talking, turned around to see who was there and found no one. Now, this was not documented by a third party at the time, and there was no controlled conditions. Memory is fallible, people are suggestible. Confirmation bias operates quietly in emotional charged situations. Monroe himself didn't call this proof. He labeled cases like this indeterminate, not dismissible, but not conclusive. And that honesty is part of what makes him worth paying attention to. He wasn't claiming he'd proven anything. He was documenting and acknowledging the limits of what he could show. That tension runs through all of his work. Some observations appeared to match external reality. Others didn't. There was never a clean, repeatable experiment that settled the question. What stayed consistent was the structure, every time. The vibration, the shift, the return. Neuroscience can explain that structure. The brain integrates sensory input to build a model of where you are. Disrupt the integration, sleep transition, sensory deprivation, rhythmic stimulation, and the model shifts. Clinical stimulation of the temporoparietal junction produces reports that sound remarkably similar to Monroe's descriptions. Under that model, Monroe refined access to a dissociative state that most people stumble into accidentally, if they ever encounter it at all. But in Monroe's interpretation, the consistency wasn't a glitch, it was architecture. Years later, he put the problem simply.
Now, our civilization is restrained in terms of anything that's non-physical. We don't know anything about it in any way, shape, or form.
And?
Again, we're dealing with an energy that cannot be measured scientifically, so you can only measure the effects of the energy.
Whether that energy means neural oscillation or something beyond it, that's the dividing line no one has settled. By the early 1960s, Monroe reached a conclusion that changed the trajectory of everything that followed, and it was remarkably simple. If this state can happen spontaneously, it can be entered on purpose. If it can be entered on purpose, it can be studied. And once you decide to study something, it's no longer a private anomaly, it's an experiment. This is where Monroe's background becomes the whole story. He's a broadcast engineer. He works with frequency and modulation every day. So when he realizes these episodes have a distinct, patterned entry point, his instinct isn't mysticism, it's engineering. Can I build a signal that triggers this? The concept is straightforward. Binaural beats. You play a slightly different frequency in each ear, say 200 Hz in one, 110 in the other, and the brain perceives a third tone at 10 Hz. That perceived beat can nudge neural oscillations towards a certain states. Relaxation, alertness, the hypnagogic zone between waking and sleep. The research shows modest but measurable effects. Monroe's hypothesis: if he layered these tones carefully enough, he could help the other people enter the vibrational state that he's been navigating alone. Informal experiments became structured audio protocols, layered tones underneath guided verbal instructions. Participants were told to relax deeply, release the fear response, and observe whatever happened without resisting. The goal wasn't belief, it was repeatability. These sessions became known as hemisync, short for hemispheric synchronization. People started doing these sessions, darkened rooms, headphones, minimal external input. Afterward, reports were collected systematically, and the results are genuinely interesting, not because they're uniform, but because they're not. Some participants described deep relaxation and vivid internal imagery. Others reported floating, expansion, and a sense of being somewhere else in space. A smaller group described experiences that closely matched Monroe's original accounts. The vibration, the separation, all of it. Not everyone felt anything dramatic, and that variance matters. If this were pure suggestion, you'd expect more uniform results. If it were random neurological instability, you wouldn't expect it to reproduce across different individuals. Instead, reports fell along a spectrum, which is what you'd expect from a real phenomenon that different brains respond to differently. The audio isn't theatrical, it's structured modulation designed to shift internal rhythm. From a neuroscience perspective, Monroe built a first reliable method for guiding people into dissociative or hypnagogic states. From an alternative perspective, he found a way to loosen the interface between awareness and the body. Either way, the man engineered a process, and it worked on enough people to be worth taking it seriously. As the Monroe Institute formalized through the 1970s, a shared vocabulary developed. Participants described focus levels, progressively altered states of awareness, each with distinct subjective qualities. The language gave people a way to orient themselves in an ambiguous internal territory. Critics make a fair point. Language shapes experience. Walk into a session expecting focus levels, and your brain will likely organize internal sensations to match that framework. We are highly suggestible under sensory reduction and rhythmic stimulation. The counter-argument: if hundreds of unrelated participants are reporting structurally similar things, maybe there's something underneath the language. The evidence doesn't settle it. Attempts at external verification, retrieving information that couldn't have been accessed through normal senses, produced mixed results. Some cases looked compelling, many didn't hold up. No single experiment cracked it open. What did change was the scale. When Journeys Out of the Body was published in 1971, it landed in a culture already primed for altered state exploration. Late 60s, early 70s, meditation, psychedelics, sensory deprivation, the human potential movement. Experiential spirituality was increasingly detached from organized religion. Monroe's book stood apart from the rest of that era's consciousness literature. It read like documentation, procedures, phases, transitions, described with technical restraint. That framing broadened the audience dramatically. Engineers picked it up, clinicians picked it up, skeptics engaged with it. You didn't need to adopt any belief system to find value in it. The book also put the term out-of-body experience into the common vocabulary. Reports of body separation had existed for centuries in scattered case studies and religious texts, but Monroe reframed the phenomenon, not as a miracle, not as a hallucination, but as a navigable terrain, a method. That shift in language changed how an entire subject was discussed. Body separation experiences aren't unique to Monroe. Tibetan dream yoga has them. Hindu subtle body traditions have them. Mystical literature across multiple religions describe them. Those traditions interpret the phenomenon through theology. Monroe stripped the theology and focused on procedure. The experiences often overlap, the interpretations diverge. Monroe's influence also reached a number of civilian circles. Joseph McMoneagle, known as Remote Viewer No. 1 in the US Army's Stargate program, trained at the Monroe Institute. He spoke highly of Monroe's work in his own writing. This wasn't just counterculture, it was intersecting with government research in whether altered states might yield actionable perception. And although Monroe didn't prove non-local consciousness, what he did was build a system that allowed thousands of people to experiment where they felt themselves to be. And once a boundary becomes testable, once ordinary people can sit in a dark room with headphones and feel their sense of self-location shift, that boundary enters the culture as real, regardless of whether the final explanation turns out to be neurological, psychological, or something else entirely. But here's what most people who've only heard of Monroe didn't realize. The out-of-body experience was just the beginning. It was the doorway. What he found on the other side of it, across 3 books and decades of exploration, gets significantly stranger. In his first book, Journeys Out of the Body, Monroe is simply mapping the mechanics, how to get out, how to stay out, how to get back safely. But even in those early explorations, he encounters things he can't explain. Not just empty rooms or floating above his house, he describes running into other presences. Some were neutral, just there, observing, but others weren't. In several early episodes, Monroe describes being grabbed, pulled. He writes about hostile entities that seem to latch onto him during vulnerable moments, particularly when fear was running high. There are passages that are genuinely unsettling. These aren't serene spiritual encounters, they felt predatory. And Monroe doesn't dress them up. He documents them the same way he documents everything else. Flatly, technically. Like an engineer logging a malfunction. By his second book, Far Journeys, the encounters had evolved. Monroe began describing a different category of beings entirely, what he called inspecs, short for intelligent species. These are entities he describes as vastly more evolved than humans, not warm and fuzzy, but benevolent, measured. They'd help him out, but not immediately. Monroe writes that they'd wait until he called out for the 9th scream before intervening, like they wanted him to learn through the difficulty first. He later concluded that these were likely the same beings that early humans interpreted as gods, not creators, but something far older and far more knowledgeable than us, operating in a space we barely have language for. But the most disturbing idea in Monroe's writings isn't the hostile entities or the inspecs. It's something introduced in Far Journeys called loosh. Monroe describes being shown, by one of the inspecs, a kind of parable. Earth, in this telling, functions as a garden, and humans are the crop. The harvesting isn't physical, it's emotional. Intense human emotions, fear, grief, loneliness, suffering, but also love, can produce an energy that Monroe calls loosh. And according to what he has been shown, non-human intelligences have engineered conditions on Earth to maximize its production. War, famine, predation, competition, all of it in this framework exists to generate emotional output. The system is optimized not for human happiness, but for human intensity. Ultimate Journeys also introduces what Monroe calls the Park, a way station for the recently dead, a place where people arrive after dying, often confused or traumatized, and decompress before figuring out what comes next. By the 90s, the Monroe Institute had trained hundreds of people in what they called retrieval exercises, guided sessions where participants would enter this zone and help escort disoriented souls through the transition. Whether you interpret that as guided visualization or actual contact with the dead depends entirely on your priors, but the consistency of the reports across participants that had no contact with each other was striking enough to keep the program alive for years. On the subject of non-human beings, Monroe stayed characteristically understated. In his final major interview with Art Bell, recorded months before his death, he was asked directly whether he'd encountered non-human intelligence. His answer?
The thing that I discovered, not unreasonably, is that we are a curiosity to other beings. They have no particular desire to dominate us or something like that. We're a nice experimental species, as it were, not much more than that.
A curiosity, an experimental species, said with the same tone that you'd use to describe a neighbor's hobby. Through all of this, the entities, the louche, the park, the inspecs, Monroe was simultaneously building something practical. The Monroe Institute formalized through the 70s and 80s into a residential research center on several hundred acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. People flew in from all over the world for a week-long programs using the HemiSync audio technology he'd developed. The participant list was not what you'd expect. Yes, there are spiritual seekers, but there are also engineers, physicians, military personnel, corporate executives, academic researchers. The kinds of people that generally don't sign up for things unless they think something real is happening. Tens of thousands of people went through these programs. Not all of them described dramatic experiences, but a consistent percentage reported something more. The vibrational onset, the shift in self-location, encounters with what they interpreted as non-physical environments and entities, and a recurring effect, reduced fear of death that persisted months and years later. Robert Monroe died in March of 1995. He was 79. Near the end of his life, Monroe summarized what 3 decades of exploration had taught him.
We have grown to know that what we are is far more than this one single life. And we are totally in a form of consciousness that is very local, as it were.
The Monroe Institute is still open. The programs are still running. The booths are still dark, and the headphones still work. And the entities Monroe wrote about, the helpful ones, the hostile ones, the ones he couldn't categorize at all, are still showing up in participant reports, described in language that's remarkably consistent across people who've never read his books. Whether that's neuroscience, pattern recognition, or something else entirely, that might be a question you have to answer for yourself.